Before we begin, I need you to do 3 things. First, subscribe to this channel so you never miss stories like this one. Second, stay with me until the very end because what happened in those final moments will leave you speechless. And third, write in the comments below which city, state, or country you are watching from right now. I want to know where in the world people still care about stories like this. Because what you are about to hear is not fiction. It is not exaggerated. It is the verified account of one American soldier who, in the span of 36 minutes on a May morning in 1945, killed 40 enemy soldiers in close combat while fighting alone. His name was John McKinney, and this is what happened when the war came for him in the dark. The first gray light of May 11, 1945, had not yet touched the canopy above the American encampment near Dingalan Bay on the eastern coast of Luzon in the Philippines. The air hung thick and motionless in that pre-dawn hour, saturated with the smell of rotting vegetation and the faint salt trace of the Pacific a few miles distant. Private John R. McKinney lay in his tent, a canvas shelter barely wide enough for a man to stretch out in, his rifle within arm's reach as always. He had learned that lesson in the months of jungle fighting that had brought him to this patch of mud and shadow on an island 10,000 miles from the red clay hills of Georgia where he had been born. McKinney was 23 years old. He had grown up in the hardscrabble country south of Atlanta, the son of sharecroppers who had worked land they would never own. Childhood for him had meant hunting in the pine forests to put food on the table, learning to shoot with a rifle that could not afford to waste ammunition, developing the patient stillness of a man who understood that survival often depended on seeing the other man first. He had enlisted in the Army in 1942, and by the time the war reached the Philippines, he had seen enough combat to know that the jungle was a living thing that wanted to kill you, that every shadow could conceal an enemy, that the boundary between life and death could be measured in fractions of a second. The Japanese forces on Luzon were dying, but they were not surrendering. The campaign to reclaim the island had turned into a brutal grind through mountains and jungle, a war of ambushes and night attacks and small unit actions that left men dead in places whose names would never be remembered. The Japanese soldiers who remained were cut off from supply, half-starved, but no less determined to kill Americans before they themselves were killed. They moved through the jungle like ghosts, and they attacked when the darkness gave them cover. McKinney did not hear them coming. The first indication that anything was wrong was the sound of canvas tearing, and then a searing pain that exploded across the right side of his head as a Japanese sergeant slashed downward with a blade in the darkness of the tent. The steel cut deep, partially severing McKinney's right ear, and the shock of it brought him instantly awake in a chaos of pain and confusion, and the knowledge that someone was trying to kill him right now, in this moment, in the space where he had been sleeping. He did not think. There was no time to think. His hand found the rifle in the darkness, and he brought it up and fired point-blank into the figure above him. The muzzle flash lit the inside of the tent for a fraction of a second, long enough for McKinney to see the face of the man he had just killed. And then the darkness returned, and the man collapsed, and McKinney was rolling out of the tent into the mud outside, his ear streaming blood, his heart hammering, his mind trying to make sense of what was happening. The camp was under attack. He could hear rifle fire and the shouts of men in Japanese and the heavier thudding of a machine gun somewhere close by. The machine gun position. The Americans had set up a .30 caliber Browning to cover the approaches to the encampment, and now McKinney could hear it firing in short, disciplined bursts, the sound sharp and metallic in the heavy air. Then the firing stopped. Not a pause, but a stop. Silence where there should have been the sound of defensive fire, and McKinney understood immediately what that meant. The Japanese had taken the gun. He moved without deciding to move, Training and instinct took over, the drill that had been beaten into him in basic training and reinforced in every firefight since. The machine gun position was approximately 60 yards from where he stood, positioned to cover a slight rise in the ground where the jungle thinned. If the Japanese controlled that gun, they controlled the camp. They could sweep the entire position with enfilade fire, kill every American still trying to organize a defense in the confusion of the assault. Someone had to retake that position. Someone had to do it now. McKinney started running. He carried his M1 Garand rifle, 8 rounds in the clip, and he had 2 additional clips in his belt. 24 rounds total. The jungle pressed in on both sides of the narrow trail, and he could hear movement in the undergrowth, the sound of men trying to flank him, but he did not slow down. The machine gun position was the objective. Everything else was secondary. He came over the rise and saw them. Japanese soldiers clustered around the Browning, perhaps 10 men, some kneeling, some standing, all focused on bringing the gun to bear on the American positions below. They were perhaps 30 feet away when McKinney opened fire. He did not aim carefully. There was no time for careful aim. He fired rapidly, working the trigger as fast as he could acquire targets, and the M1 bucked against his shoulder with each shot, and the Japanese soldiers began to fall. The first 3 went down before they understood what was happening. The others turned toward him, bringing their rifles up, and McKinney kept firing. A bullet snapped past his head close enough that he felt the displacement of air. Another struck a tree trunk beside him and sprayed bark fragments across his face. He ignored it. He was in the open now, completely exposed, and his only chance was to kill them faster than they could kill him. The M1's clip ejected with its distinctive metallic ping, and McKinney's hands moved automatically to reload. He dropped to one knee, slammed a fresh clip into the receiver, and brought the rifle back up. A Japanese soldier was charging him with a bayonet, and McKinney shot him in the chest, and the man's momentum carried him forward 2 more steps before he collapsed. Another soldier fired from behind the machine gun, and McKinney felt the impact as the bullet struck the stock of his rifle, splintering the wood but not penetrating through to his body. He shifted his aim and fired, and the soldier fell backward. Then the rifle clicked empty again, and McKinney realized that he had killed all 10 of them. The machine gun position was silent. Bodies lay scattered around the Browning in the positions where they had fallen, and McKinney moved forward cautiously, expecting more soldiers to emerge from the jungle, but for the moment he was alone with the dead. He examined the machine gun. The Japanese had disabled it, smashing the receiver mechanism with something heavy, rendering it useless. So much for that option. McKinney checked the bodies for ammunition. He found several rifles, Type 38 Arisakas and 1 Type 99, and he gathered the ammunition pouches from the dead soldiers and stuffed them into his pockets and belt. The Arisaka rounds would not fit his M1, but there were rifles here he could use if his own weapon failed. The morning was getting lighter. He could see perhaps 40 yards into the jungle now, and what he saw made his stomach tighten. Movement. Many men, moving through the undergrowth in a ragged skirmish line, advancing toward the position he occupied. The Japanese were coming again, and this time there were more of them. McKinney had perhaps 20 seconds before they would be in effective range. He could retreat, fall back to the American lines, link up with whatever defense his unit had managed to organize. That would be the sensible thing to do. But if he retreated, the Japanese would occupy this high ground again, and they would use it to attack the camp from a position of advantage. Men would die because he had chosen to save himself. He stayed. The Japanese came on in a rush, screaming as they charged, and McKinney began to fire. He picked his targets carefully now, forcing himself to breathe, to aim, to make every shot count. A soldier fell. Another. A third stumbled and went down clutching his leg, but there were too many of them and they were too close, and McKinney knew that he could not kill them all before they overran his position. A grenade arced through the air and landed 10 feet to his left. McKinney threw himself flat, and the explosion showered him with dirt and shrapnel, but he was already moving, rolling to his right, coming up into a kneeling position and firing again. The Japanese were among the trees now, using cover, and McKinney had to shift his position constantly to keep them from flanking him. He moved in a crouch, firing, moving, firing again, using every piece of cover he could find. A bullet struck the tree beside his head, and he felt the sting of wood splinters across his cheek. Another round tore through the fabric of his shirt sleeve but did not touch skin. He was moving on pure adrenaline now, his conscious mind almost detached from what his body was doing. Load, aim, fire, move. Load, aim, fire, move. The rhythm of it became automatic, and the world narrowed to the space immediately around him and the targets that appeared in that space. He killed 2 more soldiers who tried to rush him from the right. A Japanese officer with a sword came at him from the left, and McKinney shot him through the throat. The man fell forward, and the sword spun away into the undergrowth. McKinney's rifle clicked empty, and he dropped it and snatched up one of the Arisaka rifles from the ground beside him. The bolt action was different from the M1 slower, but it fired, and that was all that mattered. The Japanese pulled back. McKinney counted perhaps 6 bodies on the ground in front of his position, but he could hear them regrouping in the jungle, shouting orders, preparing for another assault. He used the lull to reload every weapon he could find, to check his ammunition, to wipe the blood from his face where his ear continued to bleed. The pain was constant now, a deep throbbing ache that pulsed in time with his heartbeat, but he pushed it aside. Pain could be dealt with later. Staying alive was the immediate problem. The second assault came from 3 directions simultaneously. McKinney heard them moving in the jungle and understood their tactic. They were trying to surround him, to pin him down with fire from the front while flanking elements moved in from the sides. It was sound infantry doctrine, and it would work unless he did something to disrupt it. He chose the left flank, the side where he had heard the least movement. He grabbed his M1, reloaded now with his last full clip, and sprinted laterally through the jungle, moving parallel to the Japanese advance. He covered perhaps 20 yards before he encountered them, 2 soldiers moving cautiously through the undergrowth. McKinney shot them both before they could react, then kept moving. The Japanese on the right flank were firing now, shooting at the position where McKinney had been, not realizing he had displaced. He circled behind them and killed 3 more before they understood what was happening. The assault broke apart in confusion. The Japanese had expected to find McKinney in a fixed position, and his movement had disrupted their coordination. He exploited that confusion mercilessly, firing from unexpected angles, moving constantly, never allowing them to fix his location. It was exhausting work, physically and mentally draining, but it kept him alive. A mortar round exploded in the trees above him, and the blast wave knocked him to the ground. His ears rang, and for a moment he could not hear anything except a high-pitched whine. He pushed himself up, disoriented, and saw a Japanese soldier standing 10 feet away with a rifle pointed at his chest. The soldier fired. McKinney heard the shot as a muffled thump through the ringing in his ears, and he felt something punch him in the left side, just below the ribs. He staggered but did not fall. His own rifle was on the ground where he had dropped it. The Japanese soldier was working his bolt, chambering another round, and McKinney lunged forward and grabbed the man's rifle by the barrel and tore it from his hands and smashed the stock into his face. The soldier went down, and McKinney hit him again to make sure he stayed down. He put his hand to his side, and it came away bloody. The bullet had struck him, but it had not penetrated deeply, more of a gouge across the ribs than a genuine wound. It hurt, but he could still move, still fight. He retrieved his M1 and checked the clip. 3 rounds left. He scavenged ammunition from the soldier he had just killed and kept moving. The mortars were the real problem. McKinney could hear them firing from somewhere deeper in the jungle, the characteristic thump-thump-thump of the tubes launching their shells, and then the explosions as the rounds impacted around his position. They were walking the fire toward him, adjusting after each salvo, trying to bracket him with high explosive. If he stayed where he was, they would kill him. If he retreated, the Japanese infantry would advance and kill him. The only option was to attack. He moved toward the sound of the mortars. The Japanese would not expect that. They would expect him to seek cover, to go to ground under the bombardment, and that expectation would give him a few seconds of surprise. A few seconds might be enough. He found them in a small clearing, 3 mortar crews working their weapons with practiced efficiency. Perhaps 9 men total, clustered around their tubes, focused on their fire mission. McKinney shot the first man before they realized he was there. The second man turned and McKinney shot him in the chest. The others scattered, diving for cover, and McKinney kept firing, working his way through the magazine. 2 more men went down. The survivors fled into the jungle, abandoning their weapons, and McKinney moved among the mortars and kicked them over and scattered the ammunition, so the weapons could not be used again. He was breathing hard now, gasping in the thick air, his body beginning to feel the accumulated strain of the fighting. How long had it been? 20 minutes? 30? He had lost track of time. The sun was higher now, visible through breaks in the canopy, and the jungle had taken on the normal sounds of morning, birds calling, insects buzzing, as if the violence of the past half hour had been some kind of hallucination. But the bodies were real. McKinney could see them scattered across the ground, Japanese soldiers lying where they had fallen, and he felt nothing when he looked at them. Not satisfaction, not horror, just a kind of emptiness. They had tried to kill him and he had killed them instead. That was the transaction. That was what war reduced you to. He heard voices, American voices, shouting his name. His unit had finally organized a relief force and they were coming up the trail, weapons at the ready, expecting to find him dead or captured. Instead, they found him standing among the bodies, covered in blood, most of it not his own, holding a rifle with an empty chamber. The sergeant who reached him first stopped and stared and said something that McKinney did not quite hear through the ringing in his ears. Other soldiers were spreading out, checking the bodies, counting them, their faces showing a kind of stunned disbelief. McKinney lowered his rifle and sat down on the ground because his legs did not want to hold him up anymore. Someone gave him water. Someone else examined his ear and the wound in his side and said that he needed a medic. McKinney drank the water and let them bandage him and tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out disjointed and incomplete. The sequence of events was already beginning to blur in his mind, combat compressed into a series of disconnected images and sensations. The sergeant told him not to worry about it, that they would sort it out later, and McKinney nodded and closed his eyes and tried not to think about anything at all. The official count, conducted later that morning after the area had been secured, confirmed 40 Japanese soldiers killed in action. The bodies were concentrated in 3 main areas: the machine gun position, the approaches to that position, and the clearing where the mortar crews had been eliminated. All of the kills were attributable to rifle fire or close combat, and all of them had occurred within a radius of approximately 100 yards. The timeline, reconstructed from the accounts of other soldiers who had heard the firing, indicated that the entire engagement had lasted no more than 36 minutes from the moment McKinney had been attacked in his tent to the moment the relief force arrived. The officers who investigated the action struggled to believe that one man could have accomplished what the evidence clearly showed. They interviewed McKinney repeatedly, trying to find some gap in his account, some indication that other soldiers had been involved. But the facts were stubborn. No other Americans had been in the area. McKinney had been alone, and he had fought alone, and he had survived. The Medal of Honor recommendation went up the chain of command with unusual speed. The criteria for the medal required conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty, and McKinney's actions fit that description so precisely that even the most skeptical officers could not dispute it. The paperwork moved through division, through corps, through MacArthur's headquarters, gathering endorsements at every level. War correspondents heard about the story and tried to interview McKinney, but he refused to talk to them. He did not want to be a hero. He wanted to go home. The war ended in August. McKinney remained in the Philippines for several months after the surrender, participating in occupation duties and prisoner processing, ordinary soldier work that felt surreal after what he had experienced. His ear healed, though it would remain partially disfigured for the rest of his life. The wound in his side left a scar that ached when the weather changed, but the wounds that did not show were deeper and more persistent. He had nightmares about the morning of May 11th. He woke up in the dark reaching for a rifle that was not there, his heart pounding, his body flooded with adrenaline. The other soldiers learned not to wake him suddenly. He shipped home in December of 1945 and returned to Georgia. The Medal of Honor ceremony took place on January 23, 1946, in Washington. President Harry Truman placed the medal around McKinney's neck and shook his hand, and said something about courage and sacrifice that McKinney barely heard, because he was thinking about all the men who had not come home, whose courage had not been enough to save them. The medal felt heavy and foreign around his neck, a piece of metal that represented something he could not quite articulate. He went back to Georgia after the ceremony and tried to resume the life he had known before the war. He married. He worked. He did not talk about what had happened in the Philippines unless someone asked directly, and even then his answers were brief and deflected attention away from himself. The war was something that had happened to him, not something that defined him, and he resisted all attempts to make him into a symbol or a spokesman. The medal went into a drawer. He wore it at official functions when required, but it was not a part of his daily life. The decades passed. McKinney grew old in the same quiet way he had lived the rest of his life, without drama, without seeking attention. The younger generation did not know his name. The Medal of Honor recipients from World War II were fading from public consciousness, replaced by the heroes of later wars, and McKinney did not mind the obscurity. He had never wanted fame. He had only wanted to survive, and he had, and that was enough. Historians eventually rediscovered his story. Researchers going through the Medal of Honor citations found his name and began to investigate, to piece together what had happened on that May morning in 1945. They interviewed the surviving members of his unit, men who were in their 80s and 90s now, and those men confirmed everything. McKinney had done it, all of it, alone. The historians published their findings, and a new generation learned about Private John R. McKinney and what he had accomplished in 36 minutes of combat. In 2017, a portion of highway in Georgia was dedicated in his honor. The ceremony was small and attended mostly by local officials and military veterans. McKinney had died years earlier, in 1997, at the age of 75. He had lived a long life, longer than many of his comrades, and he had died peacefully in his home state. The highway dedication was intended to ensure that his name would not be forgotten, that drivers passing through that stretch of Georgia would see the sign and wonder who John McKinney had been, and what he had done to deserve the honor. This is who he was. A sharecropper's son from Georgia who became a soldier because his country needed soldiers. A man who found himself alone on a jungle hillside facing an enemy that wanted to kill him, and who responded with a level of violence and determination that defied rational explanation. A man who killed 40 enemy soldiers in close combat and then went back to being an ordinary person who did not want to talk about it. The world has largely forgotten John McKinney. His name does not appear in popular histories of World War II. There are no movies about him, no best-selling books. He exists as a footnote, a citation in a database of Medal of Honor recipients, a name on a highway sign that most people drive past without noticing. But what he did was real. The bodies were counted. The witnesses testified. The evidence was documented and verified and preserved in military archives. On the morning of May 11, 1945, one American soldier fought alone against overwhelming odds and won. He did not do it for glory or recognition. He did it because the alternative was death, his own death and the deaths of the men in his unit, and he decided that the enemy would have to kill him to get past him, and it turned out they could not do that. For 36 minutes, he was the most dangerous man in the Philippine jungle, and when it was over, he set down his rifle and went back to being John McKinney, private soldier, who wanted nothing more than to go home. That is the story. That is what happened. And now you know it too, which means it has not been completely forgotten. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the price that some people paid so that others could live in peace, then do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel so we can bring you more stories like this one. Hit the like button if you think John McKinney deserves to be remembered. And write in the comments below which city, state, or country you are watching from, because I want to know that there are still people in the world who care about men like John McKinney and what they did in the darkness when no one was watching. Thank you for staying with me until the end. I will see you in the next one.